Hi everyone, welcome to week 2 and module 2 of digital writing. Last week we began thinking about the question, what is digital writing? And hopefully started to come up with some answers. Though it's not necessarily something we'll answer right away, we have the whole semester to think about it. So, last week we discussed the 2008 Pew Internet Study, which reported that many teens, at least in 2008, didn't really consider digital writing to be writing. Hopefully, since you're all taking a class called digital writing, you're at least open to the consideration that digital writing is in fact writing, and are kind of open to what writing might look like in the digital sphere as compared to print writing. So this week we're going to think a little bit more about the digital part of digital writing. This week's readings are specifically about technology. You're going to be reading 2 pieces this week. You'll read most of chapter 1 of Stuart Selber's book, Multiliteracies for a Digital Age, and you'll also read a small chunk of chapter 2 of Christina Hass's Writing Technology. I'm going to give you a bit of background for these pieces and some questions to consider as you prepare your discussion questions. Continue to work on your podcasts and take the quiz this week. So first, let's talk about Selber, and I'll also recommend that you read Selber first before reading Hass. The Selber reading is significantly longer than the Hass reading, primarily because I'm having you read a much smaller chunk of Hass's chapter. Additionally, you guys aren't primarily Selber's audience, or aren't his primary audience, so it might take a bit longer for you to digest some of the sentences than the folks to whom Selber is actually writing, which is other writing teachers. So like every author, Selber takes certain beliefs and attitudes of his audience for granted and certain knowledge that they have for granted. For example, Selber assumes that other writing teachers are likely to think writing classes and a liberal arts education are important not just for the jobs that students can get after college, but also to help students become critical thinkers about and contributors to a larger society. He also assumes that writing teachers are aware of societal and structural inequalities that lead different students to come to college with different amounts and types of resources. So for example, whether or not students have home computer access or have iPhones and are really familiar with social media technology, things like that. Nowadays, so again, that was back in 2008, nowadays that question might be if the home has multiple computers, whether there are multiple laptops or tablets, whether the students, again, have a smartphone, and what kind of software students might have had access to growing up. The question might also be whether students come to college with a computer that their parents or caregivers provided for them, or if the student purchased the computer with their own funds acquired by working part-time or full-time outside of school. However, despite you guys not being Selber's intended audience, I think it's good for you to read through this piece carefully for a number of reasons. One, you'll get to kind of peek behind the curtain a bit and see how writing teachers like Selber, and like me, think really carefully about how we teach and what we teach. 2, the big takeaway of the chapter is the 3 multiliteracies that Selber brings in at the end of the chapter. But the buildup is really important to get the context of why he's creating these new terms, all of which we'll be using throughout the semester. So why is it important that we're able to talk about functional, critical, and rhetorical literacies? Those are the 3 literacies that he talks about. What are the differences among these types of literacies? And why do students actually need all 3? These are questions you can't really answer unless you've read most of the chapter. It's also important to remember that Selber is explicitly talking about computer literacy specifically, and whether and how they fall under the purview of writing instruction. This question may or may not have an obvious answer to you based on your past experiences in writing classes. It's going to be a central question in this class because we'll be creating types of media and using types of software that you might not have ever used before, like for podcasts or for videos. As a teacher, I can't assume that you know how to make a podcast or even that you know what type of software is used to make a podcast. Those are questions of functional literacy. Can you actually operate the software required to complete a computer task? But as a writing teacher, it's not just my job to help you learn how to use that software. It's also my job to help you learn how to question that technology, that's critical literacy, and help you learn how to use it to create texts that are effective. That's rhetorical literacy. But That's a lot of different stuff to teach, to cram in one 15 or 16-week course. An essential task of writing teachers like Selber and myself is to balance all three of these kinds of literacy instruction. So, throughout the semester, we'll be asking questions of functional, critical, and rhetorical literacies, and our readings and discussion this week will hopefully give us a firm foundation to begin asking these questions, as will readings over the next several weeks. This week's reading from Hass will also help us consider questions of critical literacies. Her chapter asks us to think about technology in very specific ways, especially as it relates to writing. She opens her chapter by asking us a question. What are the implications of computer-based writing tools for the processes and practices of literacy? And that's on page 24. She thinks in particular about implications for human cognition, so how do new technologies affect habits of mind, for culture at large, and for material practices of writing. And we talked about writing practices a bit last week, but I want to spend a little bit more time on the term this week. So, to call writing practices material reminds us that whenever we engage in the act of writing, we use material tools to do so, whether those tools are pen and paper, or desktop MacBook, like I'm actually using to record this video right now, or a smartphone. Hass's basic point is that during the time she was writing, and to a certain degree even now, people in general, and even scholars of writing, so the folks who study this stuff, kind of have a vague sense that using different technologies to write impacts how you write. But they didn't at that time really have a clear idea of what those precise effects were. And a large part of Hass's work was designed to begin figuring out what specifically were those effects. So one of the studies Hass reports on in this book found that one difference between writing with a computer and writing with pen and paper is that people who are writing with pen and paper tend to take more time to plan out what they're going to write than people who are writing with a computer. Now, this was a particular study done with a particular set of computers in like the late 80s, mind you, and with a particular kind of writing task. But these specific differences caused by technology are the things that Hass is saying that we should look very particularly at, rather than just saying, oh, all technology is just super powerful and can make things easier, or technology is bad, it affects things in a negative way. So not looking specifically and precisely at these kinds of differences leads to what Hass calls the myths of technology. She talks about two connected myths: the myth that technology is transparent and the myth that technology is all-powerful. Under the transparency myth, technology has no impact on writing practices, maybe with the exception that writers can be more efficient with a word processor than pen and paper. It's faster. Under the power myth, technology is basically going to solve all of the world's problems without creating any new ones. And what writing scholars found after deep investigation is that, well, that's definitely not the case for either of those myths. In other words, technology isn't inherently good or bad, and it's not transparent or all-powerful. Technology just is. It's created by people within societal structures that influence its creation in particular ways. And to bring it back full circle to Selber, he says that writing a computer literacy instruction has to include a critical approach to technology so that we can be careful about what we put into the world. One example of these myths, and these myths' impact on the world in material ways, is the idea that has circulated frequently that going digital or going paperless is better for the earth because we will use less paper, which will lead to less deforestation, which will be better for the environment. In this myth, technology is all-powerful and will inevitably lead to a cleaner environment. However, studies have shown that even though offices and companies are eliminating paper, paperless offices and billing practices and things like that both require more energy use, often in the form of coal, and often lead to a big trash problem. Where does that old iPhone go when you upgrade to the newest version? Lots of old tech just ends up in the dump, which has its own environmental problems. So, as we progress in this course, and as you encounter writing about technologies outside this class, keep these myths and multiliteracies in mind. You might be surprised where you'll encounter them. So one final note, the discussion this week asks you to think more deeply about Hass's myths of technologies and Selber's multiliteracies. The readings, the notes and listen to, should help give you some guidance for how to approach those questions. And I'm hoping that this video, the readings, the notes, the discussions will also help you in creating the analysis portion of your podcast.